Okay, so here we are for mold making a simple one-piece plaster mold. And there's a couple of things that I want to talk about before we get started on this, and that is what we need to have to make this plaster mold. It's kind of a lot of supplies that you're going to need to have at your disposal, but most of the stuff you should have already. If you come and picked up your materials from here, you will have gotten a nice big bag of plaster, powdered plaster. Make sure you don't get this wet. You also will have gotten a bag of the Sculpey clay. This is not to use for the mold making process, but this is what we're going to use to make the positive out of. Right now we're going to be making the negative portion of this, which is the mold. All right. Other than those materials that I gave you, you want to have a bucket around you. Most of you guys should have had like a blue bucket that you picked up with your supplies. A couple of you guys picked them up early, so you maybe didn't get this blue bucket. Stop by if you need to grab one. And this is just to keep everything at bay. Plaster is something that we don't want to get all over the place. It can get all over the place. It's quite messy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we're going along. All right. So you want to have a bucket. Another thing that I have here is I got a pizza box. We probably have pizza boxes laying around. The reason why I have this is because I could use this. Look at that. It's even still got some marinara sauce on the inside of it. And this is so that we could set this down, if we don't maybe have a bucket. We just have to have something to be able to contain plaster should it start to kind of come out of the area that we're working with, okay? And that's what this, you could use something like this. I'm gonna use the bucket when I do it. For the most part, but I'm also here at school where plaster can kind of get in places and get not all over, but it can get in places. So I'm just going to be using a small little piece of cardboard, and this piece of cardboard has packing tape on it. Thanks, Jason, because this is the one that you left behind from your mask. I'm going to be using this one. You want it to have plastic on it. That's the best case scenario. So either a piece of plastic, from anything, just any kind of way that we can keep moisture from getting into the cardboard. You can do things directly on cardboard when you're doing this, but that's not, the water will kind of absorb into the cardboard. And then if you have something underneath it, table, dining room table, whatever you're working on, then that water or that moisture can soak into the under portion of it. So you want to somehow have it protected with some sort of piece of plastic. That could be dry cleaner plastic. It could be a laid out piece of plastic from a plastic bag from your grocery store, all sorts of different things like that, okay? But you want to have something like this that you're going to be building. You're going to be using this to build a clay wall around, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So we need that. You need to have some sort of an item, some sort of something rather, to be able to stir your plaster mix. And what I like to use, because they're disposable, and a lot of us have them laying around, these are disposable chopsticks. I'm going to be using those. You can use a small stick. You can use something like a butter knife, but you don't want the plaster to completely cure on your onto any utensils. All right, that's one of the big things. All right, that's why I'm not using anything that's a permanent utensil. I'm using something that's disposable. All right. The other thing is I've got some cups, some disposable cups. These don't have to be any massive size because we're not making big molds. We're just making kind of smaller molds. So a smaller kind of red Solo cup like this is fine. This is kind of the smaller version of them. So something like this would work just wonderful for it. You don't want to use a glass or any sort of even plastic container that you have at your house that is not disposable, because when plaster sets, it sets completely hard. It actually offsets heat as well. Heat will come off of the plaster. And when that happens, you can't easily get it out of any sort of container. The easiest way is to peel the container from around it or just toss the whole thing in the trash. We don't want to take a large amount of plaster that maybe we didn't use that might be inside of a container like this. We don't want to take that and pour it down our sink either, because pouring plaster down the sink, this plaster can actually set while it's in your pipes, and that could be a bad situation. So Minimal amounts of plaster can go into your sink just for small amounts of cleanup. If you have a little bit of plaster powder, or if you have a little bit of plaster that you're cleaning up, like a couple of drops or something, that's fine for it to go into your plumbing system. But you do not want to take this, if you only use half of it, and then take that and pour it right down our sink. Bad news. That's going to cause a plumber to have to come out to do some special things to your plumbing, okay? You don't have the capacity at your houses to accommodate for that kind of material going through your plumbing, so we don't want to do it, okay? We're not doing you're not getting any plaster down into our sinks, okay? Unless it's incredibly diluted. We'll talk about that as we go along as well, okay? So this is where I'm going to mix my plaster, all right? We already talked about having the plaster, and then you want to have some of that clay that you had from your mask, okay? We don't want to use the clay that I handed out for you because that's to make our positive portion, to make the actual item. We're going to be pressing that into the mold once we're done with our mold. This is just going to be to create a clay wall, and it's also going to be to create a barrier. Sorry, not a barrier, but to build up some space, okay? I'm going to show you guys how to cast something very simple. I have a ball, all right? Now, this ball is what I'm going to cast, but I'm not going to cast the entirety of this ball. I'm just going to cast half of it, okay? Or maybe a little bit less than half, I'm not sure. We'll see how where we get to. But what's nice about this small little ball, this is from like one of those smash ball beach game kind of things that they make. What's nice about this ball is this ball has a little bit, and it's probably hard to see. Try and get it closer to the camera. There's a little bit of there's a line that goes through this, okay? This is a inexpensively made little plastic ball like this. That line is our halfway mark because when the people made this ball, they made this with a two-part mold where there were two sides, one side here and one side here, so we could get it apart, right? We're going to talk in just a moment about something that's really important in mold making, and that is an undercut. We'll get to it in just a moment, but we need to have our object, okay? We need to find an object that has no undercuts, or I'm going to show you guys how to hide the undercuts as we go through this, okay? So that's what we need. Oh, one last thing. You're going to need some sort of a mold release. There's all sorts of mold releases that are out there, but for our sake, because we're pushing this clay, this oven-baked clay, Sculpey, into our plaster mold, we don't really have to worry that much about exactly what our mold release is, but we do want a mold release. It could be something as simple as dish soap, okay, or hand soap. This is hand soap that's a little bit watery. I added a little bit more water, so it's a little bit more brushable. We also want to have a brush to be able to get that on, okay? So something like a soap works just fine. If you don't have anything like that sitting around, you could also use Vaseline. Vaseline will work. It's a little bit thicker. It's a nice mold release, but it's so thick that as you're brushing it on, you could get brush marks that end up going into and becoming part of your mold as you do it, okay? Whereas with the soap, you don't really get that because it's a little bit more liquidy. You don't want to use hand sanitizer because that stuff evaporates in the air very quickly. It has alcohol in it. There's also aloe vera gel in it, which I'm not even sure whether or not aloe vera gel works as a mold release. I've never tried it. The other things that you could use, there's something called Murphy's Oil soap. That would work. Various like liquid floral waxes would work as a mold release as well, as long as they just don't dry. Or when they dry, if they dry waxy rather than drying, like a paint would dry. So nothing like a glaze or anything like that. You also could use, let's see, I can't, where am I? Those are kind of our basic things, anything that's kind of slippery, all right? There are spray release agents that you could use as well. So for anyone who has it laying around, if you wanted to use a silicone lubricant or something like that, that would work. You don't really want to use like WD-40 or anything incredibly oily like that. Just kind of hard to clean up, has a chemically smell. And the other things you could use is you could use cooking oils. You could even use spray cooking oils like Pam or those sorts of things. So cooking oils would work as a release for what we're doing as well. So those are all things we can use as a mold release. There are commercial products that are out there for plaster, things that are called Plastilube, and different various mold soaps that are made for plaster. But it's not important that we use those. We use those pretty limited in ceramics and in sculpture, unless we get into some of our more serious mold making techniques using things like silicones. When we're using things like silicones and doing mold making using those things, there's certain chemical reactions that we have to avoid and certain chemicals within certain products that we have to avoid. Otherwise, things don't set up the way that they're supposed to. But with plaster, you don't really have those issues. Something like a regular hand soap or a liquid soap, in most cases, is the perfect way to go, okay? Or a Murphy's Oil soap, like I think I mentioned earlier. All right, so we're gonna get started here, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about undercuts. Okay, so I have a number of objects here that I'm going to use to kind of illustrate the idea of an undercut, because undercuts are really important in mold making, especially when we're making one-part molds. We're making a one-part mold in this for this project, and each one of these objects that I have here could be molded and has been molded, or something like, a bolt does not necessarily come from a mold, but you can make bolts in a mold. So a lot of them can be done, but they actually have a lot of undercuts. Even this ball has undercuts, and we're going to talk about what that word undercut means, because it's important in the mold making process. Earlier I talked about this ball and how this ball has this little line that goes around here, all the way around. This little extra bit that's hanging off of there, that's still there, that can be removed and make it look a little bit nicer. This is called flashing. It's anything that comes off in the mold making or the rotomolding process that they use for this specific kind of plastic. And it's basically all the extra stuff that's there that kind of oozes out of those two parts of the mold that they use to make this object. And again, you may or may not be able to see it. I kind of see on the screen here that you can see it a little bit, but it's hard to make out, right? But on occasion, you've probably seen some objects before that have this little extra, bit of plastic or rubber or whatever kind of hanging off of them, okay? So this was made in a mold, and it was made with two molds, one on this side and one on this side, okay? And I'll draw it out a little bit here. Now, that's the only way to make this perfect sphere in this case, okay? So one thing about an undercut is that if we didn't have this line in the middle, right, if we had it over to the side like this, right, as we come this direction, you see my finger is sloping towards the top of the camera, right? And then as soon as it gets here to the middle, it's at its apex. And then once I start to go over this direction, it starts to go in the other direction. And so if I took and made a mold, and I made the mold from there, right, this part right here that cuts in, that's our undercut, okay? It's this little section, and I'm going to illustrate it for you guys down on this piece of paper. That's why I have it down there, okay? Because it's kind of hard idea to think about. This little piece, right, this is an object that's been molded, probably was made in a one-part mold, most likely. The problem might be in, well, this one-part mold is actually made using a process called rotomolding, where they actually spin the mold around in a circle to make it nice and even thickness, okay? And so the mold was down here, and something was poured inside of the mold, and then this object could then be removed to this direction. One thing I wanted to use this to illustrate is that when you're choosing an object to make a mold of, you want to make sure that it has kind of a little bit of a slope on the sides here, because when we use this and we make a mold of this, we're going to make it from this side so it comes off this direction, right? The mold will come off this direction, okay? If I were to set this flat on the table like this and build my wall around and pour it and make a mold that way, okay, that would be the way we'd want to do it because this would come out, right? But if I took it and put it upside down, all right, and I poured plaster around it and then tried to pull this out, these walls right here, because they're flared out, that would stop it from coming out in this direction, right? It would kind of trap it in that mold, and that's what we don't want to have happen, okay? So that's got an undercut as well, all right? But if we do it this direction, right side up, and only have it come to here and don't have it go over the edge, don't have it come open over the edge of the rim, then we don't actually have any undercuts at all, right? This is something that would pop out of a mold quite easily. Now we get to something like this, and if I were to mold this direction, this has no undercuts. But one thing that makes it a little bit more difficult is that these are perfectly straight. This is almost a perfect cylinder. It has a little bit of a concave portion of it right there, right? But other than that, it's a perfect cylinder. When we have something like this and have a perfect cylinder, it's not impossible to get out of the mold, but it becomes more difficult to get out of the mold because of the straight walls, okay? And when we have straight walls like that, something like this, it might benefit having a two-part mold, which we're not going to get into how to make because they're a little bit more complicated, or quite a bit more complicated, I should say. And so we want to try and refrain from using something that has very straight walls like this, okay? Even anything like a square. A square object that has straight sides is going to be very difficult to get out of a mold, okay? And then we look at something like this and say, okay, well, based on those principles, if this was the table surface right here, there's our table, and I was going to take this and put it down on that table this direction, it does have these straight edges, okay? But if I were to put it down this way and put plaster around it and then try and pull it out, here's our undercut right here, this part, okay, this little bit. But even more so, that's kind of hidden are the threads of this object. Because it's a threaded object, it makes it very difficult to cast and make a mold of because of all those little tiny undercuts. Each one of those little spots where it tucks in on something like a bolt, I'll hold a little bit closer so you can see, each one of those is going to create something that's going to lock that piece in place and make what's called an undercut, okay? So I'm going to illustrate this a little bit further here. If we have, let's get back to this object, right? Remember that we could have this object, we could put it into a mold like this, all right? Here's our little cup, okay? And we pour plaster around it. We make a wall on the outside, and we pour plaster all the way around this, all the way up to the edge, right to the rim, right here, okay? If we do that and we go to try and pull this out, is it going to come out? It is, because there's no undercut here. This is going to lift straight up, and we'll be able to pull it out because this is not an undercut. This actually helps everything out, okay? But if we were to take that same cup and put it upside down, this direction, okay, and then we're to pour plaster here. Here's our little clay wall that we made, and we pour plaster here all the way up to the top, and then we go to try and pull that out. This part right here, this cannot lift directly up this way because there's solid plaster right here in the way, right? And that's how the undercut works, okay? Let's take this idea and I'll show you using a ball, all right? So if we have the ball, okay, I talked a little bit about a two-part mold, which we're not going to make in here, but if we were to make this, here's our kind of center line right here of the ball. We can make on one side, we can make a plaster mold here that's going to be released that direction, okay? And that will come out because there's no undercut, all right? But if I were to take this mold and instead of having it along that center line, move it out this direction and have it here instead, right here, right in that little region, that's our undercut. That's what's keeping us from getting that ball out, okay? So we have to be careful with undercuts, all right? If we wanted to make this ball, instead of it being just a straight ball like that, if we wanted it to be a little bit taller and be more like a dome with a little bit more, not just a half dome, but a little bit taller of a dome, we could take a little bit of clay and tuck the clay in here where this dark portion is right here. And we can fill in that undercut and make it and take it away from having an undercut. And maybe that's something I'll do on the one that I give you guys as an example, is how to kind of cover up those undercuts. Rather than just not having them, okay? We can do that. I'm also gonna post a video. I found a pretty good video that a woman put together about making a one-part mold. She's doing it for slip casting and ceramics. So a couple of the things that she talks about don't apply, but she goes over undercuts really nicely in there, okay? So if you have something like, for example, to go back to this, if we made a two-part mold, we would make another mold on this side that could then be taken out this direction, okay? And when we do that, that's what we call a two-part mold. And those are a little bit more complex to do, so we would forget about this part right here, right? And then it could be released on both sides, but we have to have a way for those two molds to go back together, which is where the complexity comes into play. And it takes a little bit longer to make, or quite a bit longer, I should say, to make a two-part mold. So we're going to be making one-part molds. Now, getting back to finding an object, sometimes maybe it's not even a found object that you might use. Maybe you take something like this ball and you use this as a base, and then maybe you add some extra pieces to it using clay, okay? But think about this, right? If I were to take this half of the ball here, like this, that has no undercuts. If I put a spike on this, and I put a spike going that direction, does that have an undercut? It kind of does. It's a very small undercut, but it's right here. But if I take and make this spike and make this straight, if we have a line here, this is our clay wall, we're going to be removing the mold this direction. Okay, if I make sure that this is straight right here, or curved this direction, down this way, then as I pull this off, this is not going to be an undercut. But if I take a spike and I put a spike out this direction like this, that's a massive undercut, because right here, that area right there, that's our undercut. Okay, so we have to be careful. This is good. Yay, happy face. This right here, not good, frowny face, okay? That's our undercut. That's what we want to be careful of. Do you have to use an object that you find around the house? Absolutely not. What you can do is you can use your own clay, the clay that we got at the beginning of the semester for our face sculptures, and you can make your own object if that's what you would like. But when you're doing that, you need to think undercuts. You need to make your object so that there are no undercuts, and that's all because we want the object that we make to be easily removed from the mold. We're going to be taking that Sculpey, that white Sculpey clay that I gave you, we're going to be pressing that into the mold, then we're going to be pulling it out of the mold, and once we get it out, we can actually make multiples, and that's the beauty of molds. We can make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many, right? Objects that look exactly the same. These objects, we're going through this and making this so we can get an experience of making a mold, but we don't have to use it in either of our assignments or in any of our assignments. What we can do is just make these and maybe turn it into a tile or a wall piece if we want to, and make 20 or whatever of them, however many you can make with the clay that I gave you, or you can go and purchase a little bit more Sculpey and do what you want with it, right? I end up getting you as the white Sculpey clay. I like to use the white because it's easier to paint and finish afterwards. There is another type of Sculpey that's kind of I don't even know what to call it. It's like a pinkish color. And that Sculpey clay, before you use it, you kind of have to put a primer on it to make it white and have a white base. Having a white base is a lot nicer to paint directly onto. And like I said, this Sculpey clay, we're going to be taking this stuff and we're going to be baking it in our oven. And I'll give you directions on how to do that. There's also directions on how to do it on Sculpey and Super Sculpey on the website, essentially, for the company that makes it. But I will post instructions for you guys about how to fire this in your oven. I think it's at like 275, very low temperature. Essentially, that Sculpey clay is a polymer clay, which is a plastic clay. And a plastic clay will give you basically hard plastic once you're done with it, because what's happening in the oven while you're doing this is this plastic that's in the clay is essentially melting, and when it melts it becomes kind of liquidy plastic, and then when it cools down it becomes a hard solid plastic. So it'll make a hard object really easily in your kiln, or sorry, in your oven. These objects, you don't want to like make a bowl or a cup or anything like that out of them, because to my understanding they're not food safe, but we can make craft items with them. In fact, I know one or more of you guys are actually making some objects for your box project that are including or that are using Sculpey clay to make those objects. So you can make an object. You can also, like I said with like this guy, you can add something to this. But for my demonstration I'm going to give you, I'm going to make it super simple. We're just going to make some half circles. You can use some of these objects if you want. You can use them and make an object or a piece all on its own, like a tile or a wall piece or something like that. Or you can use these objects and you can add them to your human versus machine project as some sort of accoutrement to that project, or you can add them into your box project, and that may give you some idea as to what kind of an object you want to make, right? Maybe you want to make it something just very simple and give it some texture. Maybe you want to make it something specific, okay? But we want to make these objects, and you're going to need to make multiples of them. So I want you to make as many as you can with the clay that I gave you until you run out of that clay, okay? So whatever it is, make as many as you can with that stuff, okay? So let's get on to how we prepare this object to have a one-part mold made out of it. Okay, so like I said, we're gonna be using this ball, right? And if I set this on this piece of cardboard, I can't really make a mold of it. And maybe if we look at this, you can actually see that undercut that comes down this direction that's going to stop us from being able to make make it the way that we want to. So what I'm going to have to do is actually create a clay base down here to kind of squeeze and put half of this object into. So I'm just going to take some clay. The clay is going to have to spread out wide enough so that I can get it wider than the ball, right? If I'm making a piece like about this size, I want my clay wall or my mold, I want it to be thick enough. So I want it to extend at least like 1.5 inches to 2 inches out from the object, right? In order to make a nice structure for my mold. So it doesn't have to be beautiful. We're just kind of getting, it's almost like when we were creating the mask for our face sculpture for our human versus machine project. We just want to get this clay down, and we can kind of smooth it out and make it pretty in just a moment. We're not quite thick enough yet because we want to be at least as thick as that ball, okay? It's round, so I want to make sure that it's that, around 1.5 inches or 2 inches wider everywhere, not just in one portion, but on all sides, three-dimensionally, right? This direction, x-axis, y-axis. And it might even extend just a little bit past that, who knows, right? Now I think I need it to be a little bit wider, or sorry, deeper, I should say, to allow for the ball. So I'm gonna add a little bit more here. That should be good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this ball, and it's hard enough, this ball is hard enough that I can kind of press it down in there. And once I get that, I can maybe push down a little bit with my fingers to get it down a little bit deeper. So I can get it to that halfway mark. And I'm using the halfway mark that's kind of there on that ball from the flashing that we talked about earlier. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, I'm going to push the clay up against here to make sure that this locks into place. And the reason why I'm doing this for you guys is because this will show some of you how you can kind of cover up some of your undercuts if you do have undercuts in your object, and allow you to use maybe the object that you want that maybe has an undercut to it, but we can get rid of that undercut by adding clay, essentially like this, to be able to get it to the spot that we need it to be. And if it's an object that can be thrown away, another thing you can do is you can actually use something like a Sharpie marker, and you can mark on that object to see where that spot is, where that undercut lives, so that way we can kind of mark that undercut and we know where to come to for this portion of it, right? If we were doing something like this, right, and this was going to be our piece that we're going to make a mold of, we just put this directly upside down on the table, okay, right? And maybe we have to add a little bit of clay down here to cover up this little lip, because that lip right there is the undercut. That would stop me from being able to remove this, okay? Okay, so now we've got it pretty flat, right? This direction. I've got it built up around, all the way around. If we spin it, we can see it, built up all the way around, so I can make sure that I don't have any undercuts. Again, I'm looking right here to make sure that as I have something over top of this, when I pull it off, nothing down there is cut inwards, undercut, to allow this to kind of lock into place as I pull that plaster off. Okay, that's what we're looking for. So now I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup. I'll do a little time lapse of my cleanup, and then we'll talk about how to build the clay wall. And that clay wall, the whole idea why we're going to put the clay wall there is so that we can get something to hold the plaster on the outside edges, okay? There's lots of other ways that you can do it, but I'm going to show you guys the simplest way, which is by making clay walls, all right? There's something that we use in making these objects or making molds that are called mold coddles with D's, C-O-D-D-L-E-S, if I remember right. And we're not going to be using those because we don't have those laying around at home, but what we do have is clay, all right? So that is what I'm going to be doing. We'll go ahead and just time-lapse this whole cleaning up process. The things that I'm going to do is just kind of smooth everything out, make it nice so that it doesn't have lumps and bumps. I'm also going to do the same thing around here so it's ready for me to make the clay walls. Sound good? Okay, so now we've got that finished clay wall that's tall enough so that we can have enough space at the bottom of our mold. Remember, all of this you got to think about in reverse, because this is actually going to be concave, right? That portion of the ball is going to be negative space. This part right here is going to be actually the top of the mold, and this portion up here, just a little bit underneath that, that's actually going to be the bottom of the mold when it's flipped upside down. What you don't want to do is wait for the clay to dry, okay? We are not drying out this clay. We are actually keeping this clay wet because we want to be able to pull it away wet from our object and everything. We also don't want it shrinking around the whatever it is that we're making the mold of. All right, so I've got my soap, my hand soap. And so what I'm going to be doing is getting this, and what you don't want to do is move it around too much, because with hand soap, if you move it around a little bit too much, you're going to start to get bubbles and lather, okay? Same thing with dish soap or anything like that. Some of the Plaster specific products, they don't actually do that. And so we just want to get this around here and make it, you know, you're getting it wet. This is going to help that plaster release nicely, okay? And then we want to make sure we get the sides as well. And on the sides, I'm not as worried about, you know, if I get any little bubbles, because I'm getting a few little small bubbles here. But that doesn't bother me all that much, because that sidewall area is just going to be the wall part of my mold anyways. What I'm concerned more about is where the actual object is that I'm making the mold of. That's where I'm a little bit concerned about having any of those bubbles show up. So I'm also not stirring aggressively too much in my container. And this is just a old salsa container that I've you know, kind of washed out, cleaned and washed out and dried. I save them a lot because they come in real handy in doing stuff, you know, any kind of craft projects. I use them a lot in ceramics. I use them a lot in doing things in sculpture when I'm using some of my, you know, repairing stuff as well, and using some, what's it called? I just spaced, sorry, ladies and gentlemen. It's hard to paint and think at the same time, apparently. Things like epoxy, all right? So now that I've got this on here, I'm gonna let this dry for about 10, 15 minutes. Then I'm gonna come back, I'm gonna do this again, and I'm gonna try and get 3 coats at least of the soap on there, all right? So that I get a good release. All I'm waiting for is for the liquid to dry. There will still be a little bit of soap residue that's left over, and that's what I'm hoping for, all right? So we'll get a couple more of those on there, and then we'll come back to it.